Thank you. Great. I couldn't have said it better myself. All right. As you know, those are colorized photos, right? So we're going to talk about the Grant-Rawlins relationship today. And it's significant. It's significant because from September 1861 to his death in 1869, September, Grant spent more time with Rawlins than he did any other non-family member. And they came to regard each other as really more than friends. And this caused a shock to many people because if you've seen or read Grant's memoirs, Rawlins is not mentioned often in those two volumes. And that came as a shocker back at the time in the mid-1880s to a lot of people. Well, these are some examples of things that Grant said about Rawlins. On his way to see Rawlins before Rawlins's death in September 1861, Grant was overheard to say, "I could not feel the loss of a near and dear relative more keenly than the loss of General Rawlins." One of the few references to Rawlins in Grant's memoirs where he says, "I became very much attached to him." And also, in 1863, Grant made a presentation of his battle sash to Rawlins, which is a big deal. And in a letter to Congressman Elihu Washburn, Washburn was a very powerful congressman who was also from Galena, Illinois. In a December 1861 letter that we'll refer to later today in our talk, Rawlins said of Grant, "No one can feel a greater interest in General Grant than I. I regard his interest as my interest. All that concerns his reputation concerns me. I respect him because I have studied him well, and the more I know him, the more I respect and love him." So these are some quotes that show us that these two had a special bond together. But in pre-war Galena, these two gentlemen had very little in common, and they had little contact with each other. Grant came to Galena in April 1860, basically to put himself back on some financial footing and to lick his emotional wounds. He was in bad shape. He needed to build himself back up. And in Galena, he kept a very low profile. Basically operated out of his father's leather store in downtown Galena and kept a low profile. Somewhere along the line, the leather store hired Rawlins as the store attorney. In an interview after the Civil War, a reporter asked Rawlins how he got the job, and he says he couldn't even remember. So that's lost to history. We'll never know how they made an initial connection. On the other hand, Rawlins was at a far different professional and personal and social level. He was the leading Democrat in town, was even a presidential elector on the 1860 Democratic presidential ticket, was the Galena city attorney, and served as a ward alderman. He was a member of the prestigious lodges in town, often referenced in local papers, and his law partner later on mentioned that he made one kind of odd or quirky comment about Grant, saying, "Oh, he seems to be a queer, peculiar kind of man." So they didn't have much contact in Galena prior to the Civil War. So it remains kind of a mystery. We'll never know the answer to this, But the question is, why was Grant so eager to add Rawlins to his staff in 1861 after Grant finally received a brigadier general's star? And that was thanks to the work of Galena Congressman Elihu Washburn, by the way. So the invite went from Grant to Rawlins in early August 1861. Well, so why was Grant so eager to have Rawlins join his staff? Well, one thought is Grant was motivated, really took a shine to Rawlins, because right after Sumter was bombarded, there was a big meeting, town meeting at the Galena courthouse to try to figure out what was Galena going to do now in response to Lincoln's order to bring up 75,000 volunteers. So there was a big meeting in the Galena courthouse. There were speakers. Rawlins took the floor and gave an impassioned 40-minute speech, basically saying this is a time we need to fight to bring the Union back together. It was a rousing speech. Grant was in the audience. Everybody jumped to their feet and applauded. Well, maybe it was Rawlins's impassioned speech. Maybe it was the fact that Rawlins was being considered as the major for a regiment being raised in Northwest Illinois that eventually became the 45th Illinois, or the Lead Mine Regiment. Was it because Rawlins was such an exemplary citizen, or did Grant somehow feel comfortable with Rawlins? We'll never know. But there's the first photo of Grant and his staff all together in Cairo, Illinois in October 1861. This is about a month before, after Rawlins joined the staff. And we see Rawlins in the upper right. Rawlins was the adjutant general for Grant. His two aides-de-camp are on the left, Clark Lago at the top, William Hillier at the bottom, and Grant's chief medical officer, Dr. Simmons, on the lower right. So when Rawlins joined Grant's staff in mid-September 1861, thus began a legendary partnership. Rawlins followed Grant all the way from Cairo to the White House. His adjutant general, chief of staff, eventually secretary of war, advisor, report writer, administrator, the one who oversaw millions of details, the one Grant chose for a number of sensitive missions during the war, provider of personal support. The guy could also swear a blue streak, so when Grant needed somebody as an assertive voice, he could always turn to Rawlins. And at the end, just prior to Grant's presidency, the other remarkable thing about Rawlins is his turnabout to become an advocate for the African Americans in the country, being a spokesperson for their citizenship rights, voting rights, private personal property rights, et cetera, et cetera. You'd never guess that Rawlins, who was an advocate of Stephen Douglas, would come that far in such a short time. And that, to me, was another example of why we ought to spend more time thinking and writing about John Rawlins. All right, but be that as it may, when we think of John Rawlins, most people say, oh yeah, the guy that kept Grant sober. Oh my. And that's kind of how he's gone down in the history books these days. Because we all knew Grant was a lush, couldn't keep his mouth away from a bottle, and he needed a guy like Rawlins to keep him sober. Well, that's what I'd like to talk with you about today, because it's a little more complicated than that. All right? Any questions so far before we kind of plunge ahead into alcohol and Rawlins and Grant? All right, you with me so far? All right, great. Here we go. So I'm going to talk about ways that you've never considered regarding Rawlins and Grant and alcoholic beverages. And I'm going to conclude with what Adam Badeau regarded as the hallmark of the relationship between Grant and Rawlins. This was one of my biggest surprises in writing this book. Adam Badeau, if you're not familiar with him, was also on Grant's staff. He was one of Grant's military secretaries, and also wrote a 3-volume biography of Grant, of Grant's military career. So Badeau was very close to both Rawlins and Grant. All right, crash. First question to consider is, did Grant have a drinking problem? Okay. Yeah, we think he had a low tolerance for alcohol. 1 or 2 drinks would kind of get him, staggering a little bit. But I'm going to tell you, I think the bigger problem was how others used, number 1, to undercut Grant or to put him at a disadvantage, okay? Because everybody knew Grant had a problem. And if you wanted to strike back at Grant, all you had to do was start some rumors or to start blaming him for drinking and being out of control. All right. Well, who would kind of start rumors about Grant's drinking? Well, how about generals who who were jealous of Grant's success and wanted to jump over him and take advantage? Well, these were 3 guys, McClernand, Rosecrans, and Halleck, who tried to undercut Grant and claimed he had a disturbed character flaw, okay? And it didn't take much for people to believe Grant was a lush. All right. So if you wanted to get back at Grant, if you wanted to climb over his back, if you wanted to put him down, all you had to do was start claiming he was drunk. Well, on the other hand, a lot of Grant's generals who were under his command in various departments and armies, and his staff weren't bothered by the drinking or didn't see a problem. For example, regarding problem number 2, another member, James McPherson, who was early on the chief engineer on Grant's staff, had this to say: all sorts of reports are going on in St. Louis as to Grant's habits. It's said he's drinking terribly and in every way is inefficient. Hey, I want to do him justice. I'm fond of him. Oh, and by the way, St. Louis was the headquarters of Henry Halleck. You think there's a connection between rumors going on, and that's where Halleck was in command? I don't think there's. I don't think that's by accident. One of his staff members, William Rowley, who was also a Galena resident, said in a letter to Washburn, "Hey, I have no hesitation in saying that anyone who asserts that Grant's dissipated, they're either misinformed or they're lying." This is from somebody who's with Grant every day. Admiral David Porter, who was the commander of the naval contingent during the Vicksburg campaign, talked about how he was at dinner one night with Grant, said, well, wine was served, Grant didn't take any, he only had a cigar, and let me say here that this was his habit during all the time he commanded before Vicksburg. The same detractors who made false representations of him in military matters misrepresented him also in the matter above alluded to. Admiral Porter doesn't see any problems. Another member of Grant's staff, Colonel Joseph Webster, answered the issue of whether Grant was drunk at Shiloh. Webster says, I was with him all day. He was perfectly sober and self-possessed during the day and the entire battle. And after the war, in an 1887 letter to an aide, Sherman himself said that, yeah, Grant occasionally drank too much, but not when anything was pending. So these are the people who basically said he either doesn't have a problem or it's not a big issue. But there was one person around Grant who regarded Grant's drinking as both disturbed and disturbing. Let's take a look. Disturbed behavior, we usually think of that as being an inherent character flaw in a person. Oh, something resides in them that isn't quite right, that would either require treatment or corrective action. There are also, we might consider, disturbing behavior. That's how the behavior of another person makes me or you anxious or worried or uncomfortable, and we think, gee, somebody should take some corrective action there because they're making me nervous. All right, so who was this person who saw Grant's behavior as disturbed and was disturbed by it? Aha! John Rawlins, okay? Well, let's first examine some factors that caused Rawlins to worry about Grant. Why would Rawlins, of all people, take this more seriously than other people on the staff? Why would he take steps to keep Grant a safe distance from alcohol? What made him want to deal with critics who would spread vicious rumors to wound Grant? Why was he willing to apply interventions to stay Grant from falling? So let's take a look at some such factors. All right, well, one factor, and this wasn't unique to Rawlins, a lot of people worried that if Grant were to drink and go off the rails, so might go the fate of the Union. Rawlins was also one who believed that Grant was not the master of his appetites. Geez, Rawlins would say to himself, Grant doesn't have good enough control. But I think Grant had more control than most would give him credit for. And I spend some time in the book, by the way, discussing this. So let me go off on a tangent just a little bit before we come back to Rawlins. This is some evidence that I include in the book to show that Grant, I think, had more control over his drinking. One of Grant's most difficult times was the spring and summer of 1861. Remember, Grant was a West Point graduate. He had military experience in the Mexican War, and he wanted to go into the Army and serve. Really, all he wanted was to be commissioned a colonel and to be given a regiment, and he was qualified for that. Come on, there aren't that many West Point graduates who live in Illinois at that time. You'd think he would be a prime suspect for command. But you have to understand how the rejection, embarrassment, boredom, frustration that he went through to try to get a regiment. And then when he was given one, they gave him the 7th Congressional Illinois Regiment, the unruliest regiment in the state. You would think all of that would be enough to drive him to drink, but we have no evidence that that was the case. All right, the second factor, I think, that influenced Rawlins to be Grant's protector and stay was the fact that Rawlins held the belief that only 2 people could stay Grant. One was his wife, Julia, and secondly, Rawlins himself. Rawlins had an inflated idea of his personal power over Grant. A third factor, Rawlins's mother was involved in the temperance movement. And in fact, they used to have temperance meetings in the Rawlins house in Guilford Township outside of Galena. And of course, the movement urged mothers to instruct their children about the evils of drink. Fourth, Rawlins's father, James, may have been a negative role model for Rawlins. James was a good old Southern boy from Kentucky, okay? And he liked his whiskey, and he was known to imbibe, sometimes freely, okay? He's also taken a tremendous hit from a number of historians who regard him as nothing but a lazy lush. If you have Shelby Foote's 3-volume history of the Civil War at home, look what Shelby Foote has to say about Father Rawlins. It's not good. And Foote also makes the error that when he says that Father James died an early alcoholic's death. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, he lived into his 90s. So he was a good Southern boy. He had a low need to achieve. He had no ambition. But at the same time, he was active in the township community. He was the president of the Guilford Township Democratic Group. They even had a postal station in the house. It was said he cut way down on his drinking in the 1850s, was well liked by his grandkids. He lived to be 93, and he didn't have the feel of a dry drunk. You know what a dry drunk is? Somebody who quits drinking, but they never deal with their underlying issues. So they stay angry, they stay aloof, they aren't easy to deal with, but they aren't drinking, okay? The other thing that tells me that he cut way back on his drinking is because in the 1860s, when Rawlins married his second wife, he wanted his wife and kids to live with his parents outside of Galena. He wouldn't have done that if he believed his father was still drinking and had an alcohol problem. Okay? Nobody's ever said that before. I don't know why they didn't get that. All right, a fifth factor influencing Rawlins' response. Rawlins spent a little time in college, and he sporadically attended the Rock River Seminary in Mount Morris, which strictly forbade gambling and drinking. You got a strict dose about that if you were one of the students there. A sixth factor. This one takes a little explaining, and nobody else has ever mentioned this. You see a quote up there from one of Rawlins's letters to his second wife. I must have read that damn quote 200 times. It's convoluted. He says, I tell you, my dearest Emma, unless the blighting shadow of intemperance had hung like a pall over one's pathway all his life, and the consummation of his fondest hopes, and made him, from its continuous presence, fear to ask himself the question, am I to die a drunkard? He can poorly appreciate my feelings on this subject. Oh God, what the heck is he talking about? All right? It took me a while to unravel this. All right. I think what he was saying in an agonized voice is that he risks dying a drunkard's death due to his father's intemperance. Where would that come from? I had to dig deeper. Well, during the 1850s, 1860s, there was a theory, it's now known as progressive hereditary degeneration, that held that degenerative traits like gluttony, sexual perversion, and so forth are passed down to offspring. And that the expression of those vices intensifies with each succeeding generation until you reach a point where a family is no longer able to procreate. You just reach a dead end genetically. It's akin to the notion, theological notion, that the sins of the father redound to the destruction of the sons. We've heard, if you've been in church a while, you've heard that before, maybe. I heard it when I was a kid. I think that's another factor in what made Rawlins want to take steps to keep Grant away from booze. All right. The seventh factor, and we'll come back to this. My research suggests that Rawlins's approach to assessing Grant and his drinking and intervening regarding was influenced by Reverend Lyman Beecher's 6 sermons on intemperance that were published around 1830 and had wide circulation. Reverend Beecher was the leading proponent against drinking during this era. You may recall he was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So his 6 sermons on intemperance had wide circulation and were very influential. I've got to believe Rawlins actually saw these sermons in his own home because his mother held temperance meetings there. All right. Well, let's see how this 7th factor plays out in one critical incident involving Grant, Rawlins, and the Galena congressman, the powerful Elihu Washburn. That's a picture of Washburn. In fact, if you've been to Galena, Washburn's house is open to the public, okay, like Grant's house. So let's take a look at this. All right. If you remember, by the way, when we had James McPherson's picture up here and he talked about the rumors in St. Louis about the drinking, it's December 1861. There is a picture of St. Louis. There were rumors all afoot in St. Louis about Grant's drinking. My God. Well, who started all this? Well, there were some military men, detractors, second-guessing Grant's decision in November to fight the rebels at Belmont, Missouri. depending on who you talk to, either Grant lost the battle or won it. At any rate, some military men were saying Grant lost it. Well, perhaps crooked contractors were starting these rumors and retaliating against Grant, who was thwarting their efforts to cheat the government. Crooked contractors who were selling scrawny cattle, who were selling boots that fell apart during the first rainstorm, and lumber, that's another issue. And Grant was taking steps to keep these crooks from hoodwinking the government. In fact, Washburn himself went on a congressional investigation into the crookedness that was going on at that time. So if you're a crook and you want to get back at Grant, all you have to say is, man, I saw him drunk the other night. All right. A Galena businessman by the name of Ben Campbell is down there in St. Louis. He hears the buzz and he sends off an urgent letter to Washburn saying, here's what I'm hearing. You better contact Rawlins. We got to get some help here. Washburn dashes off a letter to Rawlins. He wants an explanation. He wants an explanation because if these rumors are true, Washburn's going to have egg on his face because he's the guy that went to bat for Grant to get his brigadier general's star. So there better be a good explanation for this. Rawlins is the one who steps up to the plate, and I'm telling you, I think this saved Grant's hide. All right. Rawlins took several days to construct a reply. And he knew he had to squelch these rumors before they got to the executive mansion. And Washburn, who was a good friend of Lincoln, could be the conduit for this should questions arise about Grant's capacity to command. All right, first question. How did Rawlins reassure Washburn? He's got to come up with a strong argument here to squelch these rumors. First thing he says is, well, yeah, Grant drinks, but not a lot. And Rawlins couldn't lie. People do see Grant tippling from time to time, but Rawlins took pains to say it was only a small amount. Don't you like that picture of that flask? I mean, that's a collector's item, you know? You take 16 ounces of that and you're never going to get up again. All right. So that was Rawlins's first reassurance to Washburn. Here's a second. Rawlins said that Grant displayed no symptoms of intemperance, as far as he could tell. No red eyes, no inability to carry out responsibilities of command. He doesn't have a hangover, so he can't work. His intellect isn't foggy. No symptoms of intemperance. Rawlins is actually doing a little psychological assessment here. Where'd this come from? Well, it appears that Rawlins was lifting from the 6 sermons by Beecher. In fact, from sermon number 2, which is recognizing the 7 symptoms of intemperance. And here Rawlins is going right to them to assess Grant's demeanor. My God, this is straight out of Reverend Beecher's book. And Rawlins is using this to set Washburn straight. Reassurance number 3. Hey, it's plain to see that Rawlins is focusing now on Beecher's 6th sermon, which focuses on interventions against demon rum. All right. Reverend Beecher had 2 types of interventions. against alcohol. The first is a societal intervention. Beecher said, we got to, as a society, crack down on alcohol. We've got to ban its sale. We've got to have preachers talking against it. We have to have newspaper editorials against it. Da-da-da-da. All of those societal interventions. Reverend Beecher also said we have to have interpersonal, one-on-one interventions. We have to watch over one another and, in his words, apply the bands of brotherly discipline. Okay? Straight out of sermon number 6. Okay. This is where Rawlins comes in. He wants to apply both types of interventions as far as Grant is concerned. All right. Well, Rawlins told Washburn that he loved and respected Grant. Remember we saw that earlier on another slide? That he had Grant's best interests at heart. But he says if he ever saw Grant becoming intemperate, he'd resign. That's a tough love approach. All right, that's a brotherly band of discipline. What else would Rawlins do? He'd perform a societal intervention. Of course, not over the broad society, but the society right there in Grant's camp or headquarters. He'd police the camp for the presence of alcohol. Another brotherly band of discipline. He got a pledge of abstinence from Grant. He threatened to resign, and he'd keep a vigilant eye over Grant, just as any other concerned other would do. All right? All straight out of sermon number 6. Oh, so did Rawlins's interventions in intrusiveness work? Good question. I don't know. They probably didn't hurt. In fact, I think Grant took it the right way. Rawlins was showing him that he was sincerely working on Grant's behalf. You kind of like to see somebody, who's worried about your best interests. I think the people who were most benefited by Rawlins's behavior and interventions were folks like Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton, who could go to bed and sleep a little better at night knowing that a serious foe of drink was keeping headquarters dry. After Lincoln and Stanton had invested so much responsibility and trust in Grant. All right. Okay. The most, what's the word I'm trying to think of? The most famous, or the most egregious, if you want, was the supposedly eyewitness account made by Sylvanus Cadwallader of Grant during the Vicksburg campaign. Okay? Cadwallader, later in life, had some reasons to sharpen his knives against Grant. So I think, and many others believe this, so many think that what Cadwallader said about Grant and being stumbling drunk was wrong, false, okay? And I go into some detail about that in the book. Be that as it may, Sylvanus Cadwallader was very angry that Grant's memoirs didn't contain more about Rawlins, because Rawlins and Cadwallader were very close. In fact, Cadwallader named his first son his first name Rawlins, okay? So the main eyewitness account that we have of Grant being stumbling drunk was, we believe, false, okay? There was another very famous false rumor put out by another person on Grant's staff by the name of William Counts, in which he claimed that he saw Grant stumbling drunk and vomiting. That also was false, okay? So the major examples we have of that have all been called into great question, okay? All right, this was one of the things that I was most surprised by as I researched this book. Badeau talks about what he considered to be a hallmark of the Rawlins and Grant relationship. What would that be? Well, this takes a little bit to explain, and I'm going to just scratch the surface of it because it's a complicated situation, but I think a little bit of explanation will help you make sense of this. All right. In late 1867 and early 1868, Johnson and Grant had a troublesome time together. All right, and that's what I'm going to try to explain. Andrew Johnson, of course, was the president now because he took over after Lincoln's assassination. And let me kind of maybe set the stage on this. All right. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. He was battling with Congress. He was against rights for African Americans. He was all for treating the old Confederacy with leniency. And he was trying to dump Secretary of War Stanton, who was a radical Republican. All right? However, Congress came to Stanton's rescue and passed what was called the Tenure of Office Act, which said presidents can't fire cabinet members because it was the Senate who confirmed them. So if a cabinet member is going to be dropped, it's Congress or the Senate that has to do that. Does that make sense? All right. Now, on the other hand, Grant at this time was still a general, still pure military, and he was keeping his political views close to his vest. However, Republicans sensed that he might be won over and that his popularity could be exploited. Johnson was very wary of Grant, thinking that Grant in the 1868 election might be a political rival. So Johnson's view was to, like we say, keep your enemies, your friends close, but your enemies closer. And that's what Johnson was trying to do with Grant. Okay. Well, let's set the stage for this. In the fall of 1867, Johnson suspended Secretary of War Stanton. Suspended. That's all he could do with the Tenure of Office Act in effect. And he appointed Grant on an interim basis as Secretary of War. So Grant was Secretary of War on an interim basis. The Senate then, when they reconvened in January of that year, put Stanton back into the Secretary of War's office, and Stanton took possession of his old office. All right. Now, here's the issue. Johnson didn't want Stanton back in, and he wanted Grant to hold on to that office until the Supreme Court could determine whether the Tenure of Office Act was constitutional or not. Johnson wanted Grant to hang on to the office. But Johnson and Grant got their signals mixed up. Grant thought he promised Johnson one thing, Johnson thought Grant promised him something else. So the two of them were on different wavelengths. When Grant heard that Stanton had been reinstated into the Secretary of War's office, Grant turned in his keys to the office. And lo and behold, Stanton early one morning shows up and takes over the office, much to Johnson's chagrin. Johnson was enraged. You could fry an egg on Johnson's forehead. He thought Grant had promised him to hold on to the office until a replacement might be found. Okay. Whoops. All right. So Johnson and Grant get into a testy argument about who promised what to whom. And this argument gets leaked to the press. It's now in the papers. The spat goes public. Then, in a very, very testy letter of January 31st, Johnson writes a letter to Grant basically calling Grant a liar. You said you'd do one thing, you did another. My cabinet agrees with me. We all believe you are a liar. Grant gets this letter from Johnson and sits down in his office to write a rejoinder. There were three people present for this little meeting. There was Grant, Adam Badeau, the military secretary, and Rawlins as chief of staff. Chief of staff. So Grant sits down and writes a rejoinder. Now, one thing you got to understand about Ulysses Grant is that he didn't like confrontation. He'd rather duck confrontation if he could. Well, and this is all the report after the fact by Adam Badeau. Grant writes his rejoinder to Johnson, shows it to Rawlins, and Rawlins says, "This won't do. It's not enough." Grant's lukewarm reply, according to Badeau, was simply a way to tranquilize the situation. Smooth it over. You know, use kid gloves to smooth it over. Rawlins says, this won't do. Rawlins somehow had sensed that Grant's honor had been impugned, and that Grant now was ready to make a break with Johnson. He could sense this. He understood it. Rawlins perceived Grant's true sentiments about this situation. He had apprehended Grant's hurt and Grant's preferred response. So Rawlins helped Grant draft a haymaker of a reply in which Grant assails Johnson's efforts to destroy my character before the country. Rawlins basically makes Grant deliver a left hook to Johnson's jaw. Badeau is there. He's dumbstruck. He doesn't really, he can barely understand what he just witnessed. In Badeau's words, he says, Rawlins knew he was expressing Grant's own sentiment, and Grant instantly perceived this and acquiesced. I never in my intercourse with Grant saw another exercise so direct and palpable and important an influence on him. This powerful letter that put Johnson in his place and elevated Grant above him was a stroke of political genius, Badeau says. For now, it made Grant It made any other candidate for the Republicans than Grant impossible. And this reply caused Grant to be embraced by the radical Republicans. This is what basically set Grant on the course a few months later for the Republican nomination. Further, what Badeau said is that Rawlins had not inserted his own ideas in Grant. He got them all first from Grant and would reveal them to him or even impress them on their author. This is remarkable. What we have here is Rawlins being able to apprehend Grant's verbal and nonverbal cues and articulate their meaning or intent. Counselors call this advanced empathy. I used to teach this in my graduate classes with counseling students. This is remarkable. I couldn't believe this. Advanced empathy. Who would have thunk it? Rawlins, like an empathic counselor might, could capture the feelings and meanings beyond Grant's recognition and then give a concrete, accurate, and fuller expression to them. It was like Grant would display his feelings, hint at things, and it took Rawlins to put those into clear verbalization. I wish we had any other eyewitness accounts of that, but this is the only one I think that exists. Yes.
Why